Hopefully you guys can hear this. I will certainly watch it back to be sure that everything is working. But hi, hello. My name is Mady Janke. I'm here to present on the Army Criminal Investigation Division. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to be calling it the Army CID, as it's commonly referred to. Quick, just before we get into things, we will be talking about some case examples and other critiques that do mention things like sexual assault and misconduct. So just really quickly want to throw that out there, but let's get into it. So I'm just going to do a really quick summary, some agency overview, stuff like that. So what is the Army CID? Basically, it's the Army Criminal Investigations Division, as I said, but more commonly it's referred to as the Army CID. It is a centralized, independent military investigative force with investigative autonomy. That investigative autonomy part we'll get back to later when we get to case critique and stuff like that. But that has come into question in recent years. But they investigate all crimes committed by or against a member of the U.S. Army. Kind of like how our NCIS speaker a few weeks ago said that they go where the warfighter goes and they investigate crimes committed by or against members of the Navy. Same thing here, just with the Army. So really quickly with the history, I know this has a lot of text on it, so I'll go pretty fast, but beginning with the Civil War, the Enrollment Act ushers in the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I'm pretty sure we've all learned about the Pinkerton Detective Agency in other classes, but he is commissioned to create the first criminal investigation division, cut to 1918, and we have our General John Pershing, who organized a military investigation division within the Military Police Corps. So a little different there, but we're making headway. But they investigate crimes committed by American soldiers and crimes committed by other nationals against the Allies, so pretty much shaping how the Army CID works today. Then in 1971, the Secretary of Defense, who at the time was Melvin Laird, directed the Secretary of the Army to form the CID command with control authority over all Army-wide bases and Army-wide individuals as well. And then in 2021, just a real quick name change. They changed the name to the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division as it stands today. The picture that I'm looking at right now, that is Colonel Henry H. Tufts, and he is technically speaking Army CID's first commander. So they do have a couple primary missions. I'm going to repeat myself only a couple times within the next couple slides, but a lot of their missions are pretty consistent as far as like the NCIS is concerned, military corps, stuff like that. But they investigate serious crimes, mostly felony crimes. So you'll come to find that usually Army CID only gets involved if it's a felony level crime. They conduct investigations, collect, analyze, and disseminate criminal intelligence. That's another thing. Again, we're going to get to their locations later on, but they are a worldwide military service group. They provide forensic laboratory support. They do have a very large laboratory located in Quantico, and then they maintain Army criminal records. So basically just all the regular matters. They do have nearly 3,000 agents and personnel. This is worldwide, as I stated, 124 worldwide locations, And then, like I said, based out of Quantico, Virginia. I will show you a slide in just a second about in which continents and where they're located, but they do have a couple other executive roles which I thought might be nice to mention. So they are responsible for investigating terrorism, both foreign and domestic, so long as it has something to do with the Army, they will be involved in that. They do conduct cybercrime investigations, as I'm sure most agencies do these days. Cybercrime has now become leading cause of crime worldwide. And then they do provide protective service operations for Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other high-risk personnel. But it kind of sort of works like the U.S. Secret Service, where if you're not on a strict list, you have to request their protective service, and it is selective. So this is the slide, like I said. As you can see, they are based in every continent except Antarctica, but it honestly wouldn't surprise me if they had something secretly going on in Antarctica as well, but that's a subject for another day. They do have field offices in the U.S. as can be expected, but like I said, and just like I would like to draw back to, like our NCIS guest speaker said a few weeks ago, they go where the warfighter goes, and certainly when they're here in the States, they are at every Army base nationwide. So this is just an overview of the agency very quickly. They do have a lot of authority, investigative autonomy and authority, like I stated earlier, but they are governed by Army regulation, and it is not available to the public. So we'll talk about something called a court-martial. That is not a regular legal proceeding for a citizen. Searches can be conducted through consent or approval from a military magistrate. Doesn't really matter. But then, and as I'll get into with a case example, as of September 2022, CID now has final say in whether or not there is enough probable cause to move forward seeking further action. From there, it can kind of go one of three ways essentially, but I will give you the rundown as well in the next slide. You can get court-martialed. They can also decide to drop the case altogether, but I wanted to include of note, Army CID does not prosecute or adjudicate. So they are just the investigators. They present the information to prosecutors. With the Army in that group, it works much like, we would expect any regular legal proceeding to work. They do not investigate or adjudicate, and I just wanted to make that very clear. They do have a couple of things they enforce. Again, I might sound like a bit like a broken record here, but any offense committed by or against a member of the U.S. Army, and then of note here as well is that also property of the U.S. Army. All death investigations, I'll get to this a little later, but those can include things like homicides, suicides, accidental deaths, stuff like that. Crimes committed on U.S. Army bases, for sure. That is where they do the majority of their work, both foreign and domestic, and then they investigate all allegations of sexual assault and misconduct as well. So I wanted to include this slide because I thought it might be nice to give you a full rundown of how, when the Army CID investigates, where the investigation could lead, because there are a lot of potential outcomes. But usually a normal CID investigation would take about 7 to 8 months. But I also wanted to state just below that, the CID does not care if anyone is pressing charges. When I say they have investigative autonomy, it kind of comes down to something like this. If somebody makes an allegation about, a U.S. Army member or against a U.S. Army member or something like that, they will investigate. It doesn't matter if you want to press charges or seek further action. It is their job, so they will do that. Then usually just interview the victim, witnesses, anyone else who was there trying to gather their data, gather their facts. But then CID will always interrogate the subject of the investigation, always. Usually because these investigations take place on bases, they will be in contact with, both, the accused and the accuser. But then a primary CID agent will then determine whether or not the investigation is complete and present it to a JAG, which stands for Judge Advocate General Corps. But yes, from there, if it is determined they don't have probable cause, they probably just drop it or close it. Like I said, they do have a lot of options when it comes to these cases. But if there is probable cause, something I found really unique in a good or bad way is that the subject's DNA and fingerprints will be placed into CODIS. We talked about CODIS. It's a national database, but certainly they will put your fingerprints and DNA into CODIS. From there, you have a couple options. I'm not really going to spend a ton of time on this because I'm not necessarily here to talk about the legal process, but you can be court-martialed. You can get a preferential court-martial. Sometimes a letter of reprimand, that seems to be the biggest way to go. You just kind of get in trouble with your command, and then sometimes there's no action. Like I said, they drop the case altogether. But yeah, like I said, and like is pointing out here, they do have a lot of places they could take a case, but they will investigate always. Like I said, it doesn't matter if someone is pressing charges. Okay, so I'm going to get into the organization of Army CID for a minute here. So they are headed by two men. The current Army CID director is Gregory Ford, and he became the first civilian director of the Department of Army's Criminal Investigation Division in September of 2021, kind of new there. His picture is on the top. My bubble is blocking the picture on the bottom. I'm very sorry about that, but if you want to know more about Robert Tracy, you can look up his picture as well. But getting back to Mr. Ford, he has former leadership positions with NCIS, which I thought was neat. And then there is a deputy director under him, like I said, Robert Tracy. Sorry that I'm blocking his picture. but he became the deputy director in January 2023, and he also has former leadership positions at NCIS. So I don't know if there's some sort of swap and trade going on between NCIS and Army CID, but I thought that was sort of cool and interesting. So now I'm going to get into case examples. I have two. I think they're both unique in their own right for very different reasons. But case example number one, her name is Darlene Krashok. She is the girl as seen here. In this case, originally, the incident took place in 1987, but I will get into some of the details here. Now, I know this is a lot of text, which I'm not really supposed to do, so I will try to go through this kind of sort of as quickly and as smoothly as possible, but it's a very, very unique case. So Darlene Krashok was an active duty soldier stationed in Fort Carson, which I found out is in Colorado, and this was in March of 1987. She was unfortunately found strangled and beaten to death behind a local restaurant. Getting into these case examples is where I mentioned sort of this trigger warning, so just be aware, but she was murdered. Unfortunately, in the years leading up to 2016, which is my next bullet point, they weren't able to do much. They got some DNA off of her clothes and off of her body. There was a crime scene. It was photographed, but this is 1987. They weren't really able to do much. There were no active witnesses that I could find, and certainly not that Army CID could find either. But you cut to 2016, and this is where things start to get interesting. So special agents from Army CID submitted evidence to the Army Criminal Investigation Laboratory, like I said, in Quantico, for additional DNA testing. So that DNA that they found on her clothes and on her body, they finally put to use. So they identify the subject. His name is Michael White. They get him from the DNA. But then what I found particularly interesting, at least as it's related to investigation, is that they tracked him, they followed him, they watched him go to work. But then where it gets really interesting is that they followed him to a restaurant and he drank from a fast food cup and then he left it behind. And the arrest papers that he was eventually given when he was arrested say that the detectives obtained the cup for DNA testing. So they wanted to compare his DNA to the DNA they found on Darlene. So this DNA from the cup in particular actually enabled experts to narrow down predictive traits for the subject. Those would be like eye color, hair color, skin color, everything I have listed there in bold. And they were actually able to put together a composite sketch, which I'm half blocking, but not really. You can see it there. They put together a composite sketch based on this DNA with the use of a computer of what they thought Michael might have looked like in 1987, and then what they thought he might have looked like now, as soon as 2021, in fact. So they were able to do that. I thought that was very cool. That is the real composite sketch that I found there. And then in March of 2017, there was a break in the case. So they have the old DNA and they kind of have his new DNA. And they're using popular ancestry sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. And they have this forensic scientist who found people in Wisconsin and Texas who had similar DNA. So they were relatives of his, and they were able to trace their genealogy to a distant cousin. In this case, the distant cousin is Michael White. And they, in fact, when they learned that it was Michael White, they learned that in 1987, White had lived just 3 miles away from the site of the murder. So they definitely were able to place him at the scene of the crime at the time. And then eventually the outcome of this case is that White was arrested in 2017 and then found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life without parole in 2019. So I know I went very fast, and I know that's a lot of text, but I really wanted to include this case example because I thought it was so unique and interesting how a case can go cold for years, and thanks to, new DNA technology, they're able to track down the perpetrator of this crime and give Darlene Krashok's family some justice. So I thought that was very unique. So we have case example number 2. I know I have heard about this case many times. There were many datelines about this case. I'm not laughing at the case, I'm laughing at the datelines. But I'm sure some of you might have also heard of Vanessa Guillen, so let's get into it because this one is also very important for very different reasons. Again, I know it's text heavy. I apologize. I will go through this on my own volition. But in April of 2020, we were in the midst of the pandemic, right? But life on Army bases was still proceeding, as normally as possible at the time. But unfortunately, Vanessa Guillen, an Army specialist stationed at Fort Hood is in Texas, was reported missing. At first, they thought she was just a missing case, but then June 30th of 2020, so about 3 months later, her remains were found, and ultimately they were able to determine that she probably had been bludgeoned to death. So that was like the real quick, nitty gritty on what the case pertained to, but I'm actually more interested in talking about how the case was handled. So we have suspect number 1. He's also an Army specialist. His name is Aaron Robinson. And he ended up shooting and killing himself as the police tried to arrest him in connection with Guillen's murder. And the reason they wanted to arrest him is because authorities believe he killed Guillen after he had been sexually harassing her. And this part of sexual harassment, it turns out Guillen had been reporting to her, Army chain of command, and they hadn't done anything about it. So we'll get to the fallout of this later and why it was such a big deal, but that's certainly a part of it. Unfortunately, like I said, though, he died before justice was able to be served, but they do have suspect number 2. Her name is Cecily Ann Aguilar, and she allegedly helped Robinson hide Guillen's body. That's why they weren't able to find her after she had been killed. So, ultimately what happened to her was she pled guilty on charges pretty much, in connection with the murder, and she got 30 years to life in prison. So for Guillen's family, at least they got a bit of justice. But like I said, the reason this case has taken on so much traction, and what's really important to mention here, is that she twice reported being sexually harassed by Robinson before he killed her. So there seemed to be ample amount of evidence that something violent might have already happened and will continue to happen. And unfortunately, Army CID and chain of command did almost nothing about it. And if they did, they were far too late. So the outcome of this case, which I feel is the most important part to talk about, is that in 2021, Congress enacted this law, and the law is named I Am Vanessa Guillen Act. And it removes investigations into military sexual harassment and sexual assault from the service member's chain of command. So I kind of wrote down here some additional information. In the Vanessa Guillen Act, it also criminalizes sexual assault under the UCMJ. And then, like I said, but most importantly, and I want to reiterate, it removes the decision to prosecute sexual misconduct cases from service members' chain of command. So the reason this is important, as I list below, is that this offers service members protection against retaliation from reporting allegations. Something I found in my research is that that's often the case. It's often the case why people on military bases don't report sexual misconduct, harassment, and assault is because they're afraid of retaliation, which is terribly unfortunate. But this is part of a broader effort to give commanders less sway over military justice. So again, I want to go back to investigative autonomy. I know it's not necessarily Army CID, but their system of doing things has dramatically changed since this case happened, certainly since 2021, and I would argue before that in 2020. I do have a link, a news clip to watch more about the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act. I can't play it for you on this PowerPoint. It won't let me without cutting out the entirety of my presentation. So what I'm going to do is I will take that link and I will post it under the link to this video, and you can certainly go give that a watch if you wish. I recommend that you do. It's very short, only 2.5 minutes, but it gives us more insight into the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act. So I'm just going to wrap up here with quick agency critique. I'm sure I'll get into this more later. Overall, I would say, personally speaking, Army CID's reputation is fine. It's fine. Much like NCIS, they do their job. I haven't found anybody in any corner of the internet that's like terribly torn up about Army CID, but because of the Vanessa Guillen case, a lot was brought to light. So their reputation has taken something of a hit over the years. But I actually wanted to start out by saying that I found that their structure and inexperience was not where it needed to be at all, and this is a massive critique for Army CID. So what I found was that the fort structure is not considered, good, effective, efficient, anything like that, good for mental health, in particular with Fort Hood. And Fort Hood, again, is where Vanessa Guillen was harassed and then ultimately killed. Fort Hood is in Texas. This applies to all of the forts, but in particular, these numbers that I'm going to list out below are coming from Fort Hood in the year 2016. So there were 150 non-combatant deaths on base, 7 homicides, and then 71 suicides. So I'm not trying to be insensitive when I talk about this, but the reason people are very opposed to this fort structure, as it were, is that it's not good for mental health. It's not good for checking in on the Army specialists who are there. And I found this quote that I would like to read out now that says, "Suicide is now the second leading manner of death among U.S. Military service members, exceeded only by accidental deaths. The increase in military suicides has been especially prominent in the U.S. Army over the past decade." And then subject to that is an independent committee of 5 civilians found that more than 40 Army CID agents charged with investigating felony crimes and violations of military law at Fort Hood were largely inexperienced, under-resourced, and understaffed. That would be like staffing the New York field office of the FBI with new agents right out of Quantico. So I thought that this second quote was particularly prominent because it ties into both matters here. One being that this fort structure seems to be no good for anybody involved, and also that the Army CID agents they seem to be sending to bigger forts in particular. I want you to think of Fort Hood are not duly qualified, I think, to be taking on the workload there. I certainly liked his analogy to saying that would be like taking, new agents fresh from Quantico and staffing the FBI field office in New York. But this is certainly something that comes up with Army CID, one of the reasons they have taken a hit to their reputation over the years. And then lastly, I'm pretty sure everybody could see this coming. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with the military, misconduct, in particular sexual misconduct, is, not to put it brazenly or bluntly, but unfortunately, I think just part of the environment, and I think a lot of people would like to change that. I don't mean to read this quote, but I'm going to. It comes from an academic study I read called "Reforming the Role of the Convening Authority in the Military Justice System," and it reads, "One of the major contributors to the problem of effectively prosecuting sexual assault crimes is the role of the convening authority, that is, the person responsible for the disposition of such charges. Within the military branches, the convening authority is the unit commander who holds authority over every military member within his or her chain of command. And herein lies the problem. We argue against the use of these commanders in the handling of serious crimes, such as sexual assaults, citing a host of problems with this role. For example, the unit commander may lack legal expertise, may be biased in favor of or against the accused or the victim, or may have the power to exercise undue influence over those providing testimony." And I really wanted to close out on this note because I feel it ties in perfectly to, both of the case examples I chose to include, but then I think the larger environment and atmosphere on Army bases in particular, bases worldwide as well, but just the idea that this Vanessa Guillen Act is really trying to change the structure of how Army CID chooses to, first of all, investigate these crimes, but then ultimately how they're handled and prosecuted. Certainly things like taking away the power of this convening authority, chain of command, and the sway and influence they have over these testimonies, trials, and, other such matters, I think could be really important. So, like I said, too, closing out on a personal note, Army CID, I think, does a fine job. Like I said, I can't seem to find any corner of the internet that has too many bad things to say, but certainly there are things to work on as well. But overall, I think just a really, really mostly solid field of 3,000 agents trying to do their job. But yeah, that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I will link the YouTube video to the Vanessa Guillen case in the link below my video, but these are my references. Alrighty. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it.